But now we're gonna hear Christopher Oldfield, a philosopher from King's College London and Trinity College Cambridge. As he states, as he describes himself, he's a research associate of the Faraday Institute of the Science and Religion, and he works on foundational questions in the logic of scientific metaphysics, with a special interest in the history and interpretations of physicalism. And his talk today is entitled Naturalism Without Content, where Plantinga's conflict actually.
Thank you for the organisers of this conference. It's a great joy to be here. What I want to do in this paper is really very simple. You can say simple things in more and more complicated ways, but what I'm trying to do is to dissuade people from entertaining the thought, which Alvin Plantinga has generated, that there is a conflict between a thing called science and a thing called naturalism. My argument is going to be that there is, and there can be, no content to naturalism. There's no such thing as naturalism or anything like naturalism, as Plantinga would have us believe. That's it, really. But here's where I'm going. So towards the end of his 2011 book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, Alvin Plantinga, the American great philosopher, to whom I'm enormously indebted in so many ways, towards the end of that book, there's a part 4, the deep conflict part. He offered arguments in support of his overall claim that there is a, quote, deep conflict between naturalism and one of the most important claims of current science. So as he says, as I argue in this chapter, they are mistaken. One cannot rationally accept both naturalism and current evolutionary theory. That combination of beliefs is self-defeating. But then there is a deep conflict between naturalism and one of the most important claims of current science. And to give a sense of where I'm heading, I agree that one cannot rationally accept both naturalism and one of the claims of current science, because I don't think that naturalism and one of the claims of current science is a combination of beliefs. My overall concern in this paper is to show precisely that and precisely why Plantinga's argument for the claim of, quote, deep conflict is misleading. Indeed, to quote J.L. Austin, I don't really think it's wrong at all, in the sense of not questioning the formal validity of this argument or the epistemological machinery that generates it. I'm not going to question any of the stuff about defeat and defeaters and whether all of that. My claim is not even going to be with respect to the current science of evolutionary theory, right? There's no such thing as the theory of evolution. There's many evolutionary theories of evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology. The evolution of cars and stars are very different things. But I'm not going to get into the current science of evolutionary theories. My claim is that this is a misleading argument with respect to its object. It's an argument against naturalism, and I'm saying there's no such thing. Now, importantly for Plantinga, what matters here is that he doesn't take naturalism to be a view about what there is. He takes it to be a view about what there isn't, right? In fact, he takes it to be a potentially infinite disjunction of negative existential thoughts and beliefs about what there isn't. And all of them have to do with God, well, God among other things. Here's the claim. I take naturalism to be the thought that there is no such person as God or anything like God. Naturalism, therefore, is stronger than atheism. He says you can be an atheist without rising to the full heights or sinking to the lowest depths of naturalism, but you can't be a naturalist without being an atheist. Now, my claim is you can't be a naturalist. Right? No one can be, because there's no such thought, there's no such thing, there's no content. Every single one of the negative existential thoughts and beliefs which Plantinga ascribes to his naturalist interlocutors, and I'm going to show he must ascribe them in order to generate the sense of a deep conflict, all of them lack positive propositional content to begin with, and that so I'm going to argue, is precisely why and where Plantinga's deep conflict actually lies. The cardinal difficulty, and for those who know the history, I'm using that phrase advisedly from the great Elizabeth Anscombe's 1981 response to an ancestor of Lewis's argument, the cardinal difficulty is that no one ever has been or ever shall be a naturalist in Plantinga's negative way of thinking. And here's my reason, because it lacks content. There is no such thing, there can be no such thing as naturalism or anything like naturalism as Plantinga conceives the thought. And that's because, and this is quoting Plantinga, of the vagueness of the concept of naturalism. According to naturalism, there isn't anything like God. But here's the problem. Everything is like God in some respect. Now, the vagueness here is one word for many things. If you know, Kit Fine distinguished many types of vagueness. But in 1975, Fine said, let's say roughly what I mean by vagueness. I'm taking it to be a semantic notion. Very roughly, what I mean is deficiency of meaning. But there's other things that vagueness can mean. The kind of vagueness I'm pressing against Plantinga's concept of naturalism is a deficiency of content. Other concepts of naturalism might be vague in these and other respects, but the vagueness of Plantinga's concept, he introduces it purely for the sake of argument. I'm going to show you that no one actually has this view. Concerns the deficiency of content. Naturalism lacks content. It doesn't concern the ambiguity of its meaning, like the meaning of predicates like is physical or is natural, whatever the heck that's supposed to mean, or the undecidability of its falsity. In fact, what I'm going to show you is it can't possibly be false. And this is really important. Moreover, I'm going to show and argue that the cardinal difficulty that I'm pressing arises as a feature, and not a bug, which could be fixed, of Plantinga's positive ways of thinking about the existence and the nature and the necessity of God, among other things. The mere possibility of giving content to naturalism is going to be occluded, I'm going to say, by Plantinga's actualist account of giving the semantics of negative existential claims as such. What's a negative existential? It's a claim about what there isn't. Now, in his book, The Nature of Necessity, Plantinga in chapter 7 and 8 gave an account of how to give the semantics of negative existential terms in terms of saying properties. So he said, like, nothing satisfies the property of bovinity is how you would say there are no cows, if there were no cows. And I'm going to show from what Plantinga has written, in other words, and not from the vagueness of predicates about natural, why the complex conjunction of negative existential thoughts and beliefs, which Plantinga ascribes purely for the sake of his argument and must ascribe in order to generate the sense of a conflict, lack positive propositional content to begin with. There never was any such thing, and there is no way of giving the content to that claim. Now, if I'm right, then we must humbly accept Plantinga's conclusion. One cannot rationally accept naturalism and current science. But if I'm right, you can follow Plantinga's argument from beginning to end without seeing what Anscombe called the depth of the problem. You could phrase it in the form of a question Bill Elston asked: what is naturalism that we should be mindful of it? What is believed or supposed to be unacceptable? What can be believed or held to be unacceptable if naturalism lacks content to begin with? Of those few philosophers who pretend to own or entertain the negative existential thoughts or beliefs which Plantinga ascribes to his interlocutors, I'm going to say we should regretfully agree with St. Augustine that though loquacious in their verbosity, they have nothing to say. Okay, so here's where I'm going to go. First, I'm going to just reconstruct this claim of deep conflict. It's a complex claim, actually. Plantinga's overall claim is that there's a superficial conflict but deep concord between science and naturalism, and a superficial conflict but deep concord between science and theistic religion. Now, in this paper, I'm not going to question any of Plantinga's positive propositional ways of thinking about, quote, science and theistic religion or science and theistic belief. He takes them to be the same thing. I actually think that's a profound mistake. But for the sake of this argument, I'm just going to accept all of Plantinga's positive propositional ways of thinking about science and theistic belief. my goal in this paper is to show what's lacking in Plantinga's negative or oppositional way of thinking about, quote, science and naturalism, to the effect of showing that the argument is misleading because naturalism and one of the claims of current science, no matter what it is not a combination of beliefs. It will suffice for my purposes that there are some cows. Right? That could be the claim. As soon as a little content is given to science, and I grant that he gives a little thought to science, no thought is given to naturalism. That's my claim. Now, what about the argument? What this means is we can ignore all disputes about how many conflicts there are, however many theses there might be among the many true or false positive claims of science and theistic belief, right? In my reading of where the conflict really lies, nothing was ever intended to hang on the use of an indefinite article, right? The conditional possibility of the claim of deep conflict, and indeed every premise for Plantinga's argument, as we're going to see, is predicated on the complex conjunction of an epistemically acceptable claim, E, with the content, the additional content, N, of a metaphysical belief, a complex metaphysical belief, N and E, that is not entailed by E. That's quite a mouthful, right? So bear in mind. You can formalize it as follows using some Bayesian or probabilistic jiggery-pokery. But like I say, don't worry about the details. R is the proposition, so R is a proposition, that's fine. It's a proposition that our cognitive faculties are reliable. You can cash that out in many ways. Point is, it's got some content. N is naturalism, and E is a proposition that we and our cognitive faculties have come to be in the way proposed by the contemporary scientific theory of evolution, whatever that might be, right? And P of blank given blank is a shorthand for the probability of blank given blank, okay? Did you spot it? It's just a word. R is a proposition, E is a proposition, naturalism is not. It's just a word. Now, having mentioned R, let me just say that the existence, function, or reliability of a faculty for producing metaphysical beliefs is not at issue in my paper. However, we might come to believe and accept and rejoice in such things as metaphysical beliefs is not my concern. Also, it's worth saying that in some versions of his argument, he ties E, the evolutionary theory, to a particularly mechanistic view of evolution, which there's no need to do that. In fact, in his official version, he doesn't make that kind of commitment. Okay, so if you're familiar with kind of extended, embodied, inactive organicist theories that are maybe less mechanistic, don't worry. And in his 1993 book, Warrant and Proper Function, the probability at issue is a much more complex one. It's the probability of P of R given N and E and C, where C is an even more complex proposition whose precise formulation is difficult and unnecessary, thank God, but which states what cognitive faculties we have and what sorts of beliefs we produce. Now, whatever sense can be made of our cognitive faculties in C, I'm just going to ignore all of that for the sake of showing what's lacking in Plantinga's argument against naturalism N, okay? My claim is that N lacks content irrespective of E, R, and C. The one thing we must grasp is dialectically essential for understanding Plantinga's argument, and also for Daniel Dennett and Plantinga's dialectical or positional stance on this issue, that E does not entail N. That's absolutely crucial. So whatever the theory is, you've got the scientific theory on the one hand and the metaphysical add-on on the other. That's a striking point of agreement, actually, between Dennett and Plantinga, even if, as Dennett thinks also as a practical or theoretical goal, naturalism were also tacitly assumed throughout scientific inquiry in courts of law, reputable courts of law, he says. Even if that was true, right, it's irrelevant to the argument, right? It's an additional claim. And notice that it's completely consistent, by the way, with Daniel Dennett's saying that naturalism is tacitly assumed, that nothing is tacitly assumed. So I actually agree with Dennett on this. But I think that Dennett was thinking of naturalism as a practical or theoretical goal rather than as the content of a metaphysical belief. If anyone doesn't think there are such things as metaphysical beliefs, it's Daniel Dennett. Okay, so here's a couple of questionable metaphilosophical assumptions. Again, I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but many philosophers have denied that naturalism is a metaphysical belief. Right? I'm one of them. I'm going to argue that it isn't. And some have argued, moreover, that to identify naturalism with the content of a metaphysical belief is to participate in a metaphilosophical error. I'm also one of these philosophers. I think this is a profound mistake. I'm trying to develop a view I call the activity view, according to which what's at stake in naturalism is the spirit of an activity, not the content of a theory, right? But I'm not going to impute my views, metaphilosophical views, to Plantinga, okay? That's not the mistake he's making. Although it's more grist to my mill if I can show that it lacks content in his way of thinking. What else could it be? Right? Naturalism could function as a quasi-religion, but not as Plantinga would have us believe. That would be my conclusion. There's also a philosophy of science worry. I'm a Van Fraassen fanboy, right? So I'm a constructive empiricist about the scientific image. And there are philosophers who deny that current science ought to be believed, right? Van Fraassen and so on. And some have argued, moreover, that to identify the content of a scientific theory with the intentional object of a belief is just a meta-scientific error. And I agree, right? But again, that's all in the weeds. We don't need to get into any of that. All that we need is some content for E to show that there's no content can be given to N. That's my claim. Okay, so the argument, since Plantinga first introduced an argument, an evolutionary argument against naturalism in 1991, the argument's actually developed in stages and been revised in many ways in response to various friends and critics of the argument. In its official and final version, at least what he hopes was the official final version, the argument is formally valid, and it has 4 premises, right? And here's the point. As long as you've got any premise that involves the conditional probability of N and E, or even a belief in N and E, you're going to have a problem because there's no such thing, right? In fact, it's really, really important here to note that this argument is not an argument for the claim that naturalism and evolution are a conjunction of false beliefs. It's really important. In fact, here's a little proof. Suppose for reductio that naturalism were a false belief, i.e. suppose that it was known or held to be true that in probabilistic terms the probability of N was equal to 0. Well, hold on, by Kolmogorov's axioms of conditional probability, the formula for conditional probability P of A given B is only defined when the P of B is greater than 0. Right? I mean, maybe that's contentious, but that's my understanding. And so if you've got P of N equaling 0, then anything involving P of N is going to be 0. And so if P of N and E is no greater than 0, then the conditional formula in the probability would be 0 over 0, which is undefined, right? It would have no value at all according to the axioms of conditional probability. Right? This matters, folks. However you're going to take the probabilities involved, whether objective, subjective, or epistemic credence functions, it matters that the conditional probability formula is going to have no value at all. Note, not some vague range of values in the range 0 to 1, not any high or low value, not some low or inscrutable value, no value, and certainly not 0 value. Now why does this matter? It matters because Plantinga himself is quite misleading here. Notice what he says, my quarrel is not with the scientific theory of evolution. Good. Neither is mine. Nor is it an argument for the conclusion that unguided evolution could not produce creatures with reliable belief-forming faculties. Fine. I very much doubt that it could, he says, but that it couldn't is neither a premise nor a conclusion of my argument. That's really important. Still further, my argument will not be for the conclusion that naturalism is false, although of course I believe that it is. Now just a minute. If naturalism is false, no argument would be required, and in fact if naturalism was false, the first premise would be false. Right? What I will argue, so that's misleading, because if naturalism was false, if the P of N was 0, the argument wouldn't go through, right? What I will argue, he says, is that naturalism in conflict with evolution, a main pillar of contemporary science, that's misleading. The conflict in question is not that they can't both be true, I agree. The conflict is not that there's a contradiction between them, I also agree. The conflict is rather that one can't sensibly accept them both, I also agree. I mean to argue that one can't sensibly believe both naturalism and, right, I agree. But my concern is with what is supposed to follow. If my argument is accepted, what follows is that there is a deep and serious conflict between science and naturalism. My concern is with his prior assumption of naturalism's falsity, it can't be, and with his supposition of what would follow, that there's a conflict between this thing called science and this thing called naturalism. Okay, so what is the view supposed to be? I should speed up.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, all right. I'll cut to the point. Naturalism is one word for many things, and we can go to this in the Q&A. Nobody in the literature defines naturalism in Plantinga's way. These are the most prominent philosophical naturalists of Plantinga's generation. Few of them take naturalism to be a claim about what there is. None of them take naturalism to be a claim about what there isn't. That's my strong claim. Certainly not Plantinga's claim. The two closest were Armstrong and Nielsen, but they have a whole mix. We can get into that. Some are prescriptive claims about how we should do things. Some are epistemological claims about how we can know things. Very few of them are metaphysical claims about what there is, and the implications for what there isn't are just not there. In fact, if you were tracing a historical genealogy, you may wonder whose naturalism is supposed to be the target of the argument. In 1993, Plantinga is almost nonchalant. It isn't easy to say, but maybe we don't need to. Here's a couple of people. Now, whatever, with all due respect to these great fellows' views with respect to, quote, the God of traditional theism, that's irrelevant to the issue of Plantinga's argument. Remember, the issue is a conditional probability, and the probability can have no value if no value can be given for n. For the sake of argument, Plantinga sometimes takes naturalism to include materialism, and I'm just going to show why all of his attempts to add content by including materialism are neither necessary nor sufficient to generate the conflict. He sometimes says taking naturalism to include materialism with respect to human beings. Now, it's not clear why he needs to do that. But in fact, it's irrelevant to the argument. We can get into that. Now, from my perspective, it's clear why he needs to take naturalism to include some positive content to generate some thoughts. But from his perspective, it's not clear why he does it. Sometimes it sounds like he's mind-reading these imaginary naturalists. Yeah. And if it were truly an implication of naturalism or even materialism with respect to human beings, that beliefs are events, which is what he thinks it implies, then anyone who doubts the beliefs are neural events, right? For a whole host of materialists I can think of who doubt that, would just deny the antecedent materialism. But of course it isn't a consequence of materialism, even with respect to human beings, the beliefs are events. So Plantinga is well aware of wide content, and externalism about content and embodied cognition. He says, I'm just ignoring that. Nothing in my argument hinges on that omission. And he's right. Nothing hinges on materialism at all. Now, here's the real problem. The vagueness of naturalism. Right? I'm going to go over by about 2 minutes. I'm sorry about that. Here's the problem. In his 1983 essay, he asked the question, what exactly is a theistic belief? He says it's to make an existential assertion, to answer the ontological question, what is there? Now, if I ever thought that there was only one question that deserved to be called the ontological question, and I took that question to be Quine's question, what is there? Then I would call the question, what isn't there, the negative ontological question. Now, whatever others have said, the ontological problem, which Quine saw could be applied to all sorts of ontological questions, is that the question, what is there, needs to be reformulated, right? Reformed philosophy in order to make the disagreements explicit. We look to bound variables, Quine says, not to know what there is or isn't, but to know what someone's saying there is or isn't. Amen to that, Quine. So we could formalize the complex conjunction of negative existential thoughts that Plantinga takes naturalism to be as a complex conjunction of N1 and N2. N1 is atheism, N2 is stronger than atheism. I'm using the predicate G to be a monadic predicate for one of the properties of God. Whatever you take divinity to be, that'll be G. And I'm using the monadic predicate letter F to express one of the properties of God. If you're a believer in divine simplicity, you might think there is only one property of God, right? You might say that Fx is Gx. I'll cut to the chase. All you're going to need is for any attribute of God, you're going to be able to find something that is like that in some way. So suppose that God exists, right? Or that God is supposed to exist. then anything that, or suppose that God is self-identical, right? Then anything that is self-identical is going to be like God in some way. Suppose that God is omniscient, right? Such that Lady Wisdom, she knows all truths, she believes nothing false. Well, then something that believes nothing false, say a rock, has no false beliefs. It's going to be like God in at least some respect of having no false beliefs. Suppose God is supposed to have the property of numinosity, or being such that our concepts don't apply to it. Well, then any merely possible being such that our concepts don't apply to it would be like God in some respect. Suppose that God is supposed to have the property of necessary existence, being such that it exists in all possible worlds. Then everything with the property of necessary existence will be like God in some respect. The problem is going to be that everything is going to be like God in some respect. Now, why does this matter? It matters that, for Plantinga's argument, there'll be no way of cashing out the claim, which makes sense in any possible world. Why does this affect Plantinga's reasoning? Well, he says, consider a hypothetical species that is cognitively a lot like us. Members of this species hold beliefs, make inferences, change beliefs, and the like. And let's suppose that naturalism holds for them. I'm saying you can't. If they've got beliefs, then they're going to be like God in some respect. So it's an impossible thought experiment. So I'm just going to cut to the end. Naturalism lacks content. That's where the conflict actually lies. Thank you for your patience.